Piece of property here is a remnant of Dogue Run Farm. So you just drove down this road, you would have driven right through the middle of Union Farm. And then once you cross the creek, you're at the beginnings of Dogue Run. This area of the plantation had always had a mill, and we think George Washington's father built a mill on this creek, about a third of a mile up the creek. That early mill by the 1760s is now in pretty poor condition. So Washington is knowing by 1760 that he's either going to have to repair that mill or build a newer mill. Mills don't last forever, you get to retool them, they're wooden machines. And of course, once Washington decides that he's going to get out of tobacco and switch to grain, a new mill becomes even more important, because he's going to need a merchant mill, which is going to be much larger. They can manufacture wheat flour for export market. So the earlier mill on this property was what we call a country mill or plantation mill. It really ground for the needs of the plantation. This mill is going to do his own needs plus a major export business. So in the mid-1760s, when Washington transitions out of tobacco and starts growing wheat, he realizes, I'm going to need to find a place to build a new mill. And he picked this spot along Dogue Creek because the water source is here. That's why the mills were here. It's a water-powered mill. So Washington joins with another landowner, a neighbor who had a mill, and they walked the ground and they determined this spot here was the best place for it. We'll talk more about why in a couple moments, but the main point was the water was here. So to get the water to the mill, Washington's going to have to build a new mill pond, and that means building a dam and impounding water. Water wheels need lots of water to operate throughout the year, so you can't just set it on a small creek. You need to be on a big creek or a big river, or in Virginia, in a lot of colonies, you build mill ponds. So his farm went back another 2 miles. In fact, most of Dogue Run Farm was above Route 1. So that's how far it stretched. And way up above there on the creek, he dammed the creek and impounded water into a large mill pond. And then he had to build a mill race, which is like an earthen canal, to bring water all the way down to the lower elevation where the mill was. So pond is going to be up here, mill's going to be down here. That mill race was almost 2 miles long. And that's really because the topography dictated that he needed to have the pond back here so he can bring a feet head of water over a wheel down here at the lower elevation. So it took a year for them to trench the mill race. Now all this takes place in 1770-71. By early spring of 71, the mill is completed, the race is done, and he starts operating. By June of 1771, this mill exports 128,000 pounds of flour. So this is a major commercial mill. It's one of the profit centers for Washington for most of his life. And the mill was so important to him when it was being built, his diary notes that he rode out here morning and afternoon to see its construction. So he's a hands-on manager, as you probably already know by now. He managed by being seen oftentimes. And so if he's home and you're working for him, whether you're paid, indentured servant, or slave, you know Washington will make this round through the farms, and he's checking on everything. So the mill was the same way, very important to him. So from 1771 to 1790, the mill is a very profitable mill, with the exception of the Revolution. You know, commerce was greatly impacted by the American Revolution, but it's a very cutting-edge mill. But Washington upgrades the mill in 1791. He learns of a new automated flour milling system that had been patented. And it's quite interesting how he learns about it, because in early American history there wasn't a patent office. You had to get patents in each individual state. So in 1790 they formed the U.S. Patent Office, and as president, Washington had to put his signature on approved patents. So this certain patent crossed his desk for the automated flour mill system, invented by a man named Oliver Evans. And Washington read it over, signed it because it was an approved patent, told his secretary, Tobias Lear, to contact Evans because he wants this installed in his mill. What Evans invented was a system to move grain through a mill automatically, like an assembly line production method. He's the man who invented the bucket elevator, which is a continuous belt with little cups every 8 inches or so that'll scoop grain and flour and move it upstairs in the mill automatically. He also invented a flour cooler, and he connected all of these inventions into a continuous flowing system. And George Washington realized on paper that this was ingenious and it would improve his mill. Now, as a comparison, Evans was from Delaware, near Wilmington, and the mills around him at first rejected his ideas. So these people around there saw working mills with the new system, and they rejected it. Washington sees it on paper and realizes, this is what I need. So if he thought something, an innovation was worth it, would improve his businesses, he would invest in it. So he paid the $50 required as a licensing fee and had Evans sent his brother out here, who was a millwright, to help Washington's millwright, who was a hired contractor, retrofit the mill with the elevator system and connect everything. So we've replicated that in our reconstruction. So we're going to show you that today. It's very unique. So what this means is 2 men can run the mill, make 5,000 pounds of flour a day, and do it much more efficiently than the older system. Now, by way of introduction to the site, the building right over there is the whiskey distillery. And that was built 1797, 1798. So that is the last major business in Washington's life before his death. And the reason he put it out here by the mill is you need grain and water to make whiskey. Now, the whole idea, though, of whiskey making wasn't Washington's at all. As he retires from the presidency in 1797, he hires a new farm manager who happens to be a Scottish immigrant named James Anderson. And it's Anderson's idea to build a distillery here. He writes a letter to Washington right after getting the job and says, if you allow me to build a distillery, I can make a lot of money for you. And at first, Washington's hesitant. You know, he's 65 years old now. He's not planning on a new business. Secondly, he was worried about the type of people that might be attracted by a distillery. He wrote, I have a lot of idlers at my mill, and will they come next door and tempt the distiller or rob him? So Anderson obviously was pretty shrewd about this and convinced Washington that I'll be able to make sure none of that happens. And Washington also did his homework. He wrote a friend in the rum business and asked him about this plan. And his friend wrote back and said that Anderson has a great reputation, and as much whiskey as you make, you'll sell. So George Washington's wheels start turning, and he thinks, this might be a good retirement income for me. And if you think about it, Washington was often land rich and cash poor. When he went to his first inaugural, he had to borrow money from the bank. So with flour, he's making money on it, but it has to be shipped to the Caribbean islands or to Portugal or Spain, and then you have to wait for the return. Tobacco was a really bad situation because you got tobacco notes, credit on goods. So this is a whiskey that's drank locally, mostly in Alexandria. It's unaged, so it goes right to market, and the money comes right back. So he made a lot of money in whiskey the last 2 years of his life, and we'll go into great detail when we go next door. So what we're going to do now is head down into the mill, and we're going to get inside and talk about how it works, and we're going to run the mill for you, let you see everything, and then we'll head next door and talk about the whiskey side of this site, okay? All right, let's head.